Jeff Finkel, CEO of the Arcview Group, and thank you for joining us today, whether you're joining us direct or through live streaming. Now, before I begin today's programming, I'd like to just give a quick show of support for our backstage team, Carolyn, Connor, and Guillermo. Thank you for being well organized and helping us produce these content segments. Thank you, team. I'm really excited about today's program, but honestly, it's a tough one because the subject matter isn't a pleasant one, but it's an extremely important one and sadly, a topical one. So quickly, before I set the stage for today, please take a few seconds to complete the poll, which I think you'll see popping up on your screen momentarily. There it is. Let me thank our viewers, those who've been part of our community at some point since our founding, 2010, and extend a warm welcome to our viewers that are new to our community. So for the newbies, just to give you some background, the Arcview Group was founded by Troy Dayton and Steve DeAngelo to create the first of its kind and much needed safe haven for both investors, entrepreneurs to build the cannabis industry with social equity at their core and the goal of moving past the stigma around the plant. We produced over 50 investor conferences, facilitating over $300 million in equity financing in over 250 companies since 2010. We just hosted two, one in New York City in October, one in Miami in December, and they were really extraordinary. And we will create more in-person events focused on investing with thought leaders in these areas, so stay tuned for future announcements. And we will also continue our digital webinars like today's, because we all want to keep learning, right? And there's a lot to learn as this is a complex industry to navigate. Now, in addition to producing investor summits and digital content, we operate a venture fund. We look for companies at the early growth stage, so ideally post-revenue. And we are also open to creating special purpose vehicles made up of investor members of our community. We find an opportunity that's compelling. So be sure to connect with us if you think that you meet the criteria. Now, a key part of our ecosystem is our consulting group, who provide license application services, business planning, investor presentations, cultivation facility planning, and brand expansion into other states, as well as brokerage service for used equipment. To learn more, please go to www.arcviewconsulting.com. Now, I guess this would be the moment for me to announce that we are now offering a liquidation advisory service to help officers, boards, and our VC friends wind down companies outside of the court system without losing control of the process. So boards, once they make that decision, can focus on growing and fixing the rest of their companies, and most of the officers can move on and decide what's next for them. So reach out to me if you'd like to learn more. We also have a marketing services group that offers a full range of services, including branding, collateral, website development, lead gen strategy, and a fractional CMO service. And lastly, check out our library of impactful programs with industry thought leaders, seen by close to 37,000 people that have registered for these webinars since 2020. Maybe we can get those links up into the chat screen. All right, before we move on, let me just take a moment to thank our strategic alliance partners, Green Tank, a provisioner of innovative vape hardware, PayQuick, offering treasury services to cannabis licensees. They're about to complete their merger with Green Check Verified. SuperNet, which provides a closed-loop credit card service for cannabis dispensaries, and our data partner, Hoodie Analytics. We appreciate their support and their place in this ecosystem and community. All right, let's get going. Now, to frame this discussion, I'm going to do a little framing here. Let me share a quick overview of the 2022 capital markets activity from our good friends over at Viridian Capital Advisors. Cannabis capital raises for 2022 were down 65.6% from 2021. Total equity issuances off 75%, total debt issuance down 53%, US debt only down 47%, but Canadian debt is down a more significant 76%. So, as it's clear, we are in a very difficult capital markets environment. And this is what's going on. Now, I think this is driven by three core reasons. First, Clearly, the lack of regulatory progress. I think the equity and even the debt markets expected that with Biden's election 2020 and the Democrats' majority in the House and Senate, that there would be substantial progress on the regulatory front. Meanwhile, existing bills like the MORE Act and the States Act made no progress, and SAFE, while passing the House, I think, 7 times, failed the Senate. And most recently in the lame duck section in December, we all had high hopes. Progress would have paved the way for more institutional capital, which brings me to the second reason. The supply and the demand of new capital is greatly out of balance. Now, while this was only felt at the seed stage initially, over the last few years, it's been felt all the way up and down the capital stack. So from 2020 on, a number of the existing and successful fund managers went out to raise successor funds with $100 million, $200 million targets, and most of them only raised half that amount or even less than half. And of the seed funds that started in 2015, 16, and 17 that had raised $25 or $50 million funds, that capital has been deployed. And the ones with fresh capital are holding back a bigger percentage from funding new companies and increasing their reserves to support their existing portfolio like they should. The third reason, again, is the lack of enforcement giving continued life to the illicit market. You guys know this story. Illicit market in California is 3x the size of the legal market, and product is selling for half the price, driven by thoughtless tax policy and poor enforcement. And in New York, while there are 3 or 4 legal adult rec dispensaries, there are, ready, 1,400 illegal ones. Not a good start. And on top of that, we certainly have a deteriorating macro environment with inflation concerns, increasing interest rates. Now, I'm going to deviate a little from this narrative. I gave you the bad, but let's be clear. Long term, we remain bullish on this industry. 2022, the U.S. cannabis industry grew 19% to $32 billion, up from $27 billion in 21. That growth rate decreased from 35% a year earlier, but is expected to remain steady at 15 to 20% for the next 2 years. So eventually that 32 billion will grow to 100 billion. Now, we're just in a very difficult cycle. And despite the fact that there's not enough capital, there clearly is some capital in this industry. At our 2 events in October and in December, we put 25 fund managers on stage at 2 of these summits, and they talked about the size of their fund, their average check size, and what they value in entrepreneurs. So there is some capital, there just isn't enough, and terms are definitely favoring investors at the expense of operators. All right, I'm just going to frame a little bit further before we get into the Q&A. I think it's also important to understand historical returns for venture capital funds. So typically, if a fund invests in 10 companies, they'll generate one huge winner, and that oftentimes returns the entire fund. They'll have a second successful exit, a few that will return invested capital, maybe a small return, and 4 that will come up 0. And here's a little known fact. The difference between the venture firms whose returns are in that top decile, that top 10%, and those, let's say, in the top quartile, the top 25%, is that their big winner return 50, 75, or 100x, as opposed to, let's say, 20x for the ones in the top quartile. So what does that tell us? It tells us simply that companies fail, even ones backed by the smartest people with years of experience. So that's what we're dealt with, and that's why we're going to have this problem. All right, so what do you do if it's not working? Now, we would all agree that the growth business is a lot more fun than the sick or the death business. But the state of capital markets has put cannabis investors in the sick business so that they can avoid the death business. And you know what? Sometimes you can't avoid it. Sometimes it's going to happen. And there are less options if you're a state licensed plant touching cannabis business, which despite its state status, as we all know, is still federally illegal. So that is what we are exploring today. And we're exploring it with our panelists. So let me welcome them. Let me first welcome Tiffany Liff, Managing Director of Entourage Effect Capital. Welcome, Tiffany. There you are. David Friedman of Panther Capital. Hello, David. I think he's coming. Jan Giron of Giron Legal Advisors and Arcview Management Consulting. Jan is going to help us drive this wind down practice. Welcome, Jan.
Hi, thank you.
Let me ask you each to intro yourself more thoroughly. Let's start with you, Tiffany.
Hi, Tiffany Liff with Entourage Effect Capital. We're a growth venture capital fund in the space. We've been around since 2014, currently investing our third fund. And like Jeff mentioned earlier, we are actively investing, but withholding a lot of capital in Fund 3 for follow-on investments into our current portfolio companies with the uncertainty in the capital markets right now.
Tiff, let me quickly thank you for your contribution now, because I know you're going to have to leave halfway through today's programming. So we'll direct some early questions to you, but thank you for being here. David?
Hi, David Friedman. I'm with Panther Capital. We're a boutique investment firm that has, over the last 30 years, invested in a number of venture capital deals, probably in the 50-60 range, early stage tech initially, and then in 2013, we pivoted over to cannabis. And I have a particular area of concentration in working with our portfolio companies that are either at the front of the pack or the back of the pack. And that involved a lot of workouts, mostly from within the portfolio companies as an investor principal, but occasionally for some friends and other colleagues who've asked me to step in and help with wind downs and restructurings and those sorts of things.
Great, thank you. And Jan?
Hi, I've focused most of my career, all of my career, in fact, on bankruptcy matters. I'm working in insolvency, wind downs, liquidations, ever since I started practicing back in 1989. I've been a bankruptcy trustee since 1993. In that capacity, I get appointed by the federal court in New York and Manhattan to wind down certain companies, to restructure them. I've also served as an assignee for the benefit of creditors. We're going to touch a little bit on ABCs a little bit later down the line, but my focus has always been on the downside of the business and maximizing value for creditors and protecting the directors and officers.
You're an expert in the sick business.
Yes, as bad as that sounds.
All right, let's get going. Tiff or David, what typically is the catalyst for a company's board to decide to restructure or considering winding down a company? What kicks it off?
Usually there's some impending debt payment that's due that is not going to be able to be made, or some sort of event of default that's happening or occurring. And that's when, I mean, let's be, everybody in the space right now is somewhat distressed in some way, shape, or form, whether they could be making money, but after taxes, nobody's making money because of the tax burden on all the cannabis companies in the space right now. So we all operate every day kind of in a restructuring basis in general, but there becomes a time when there isn't additional capital to be deployed into the company, whether that's from outside sources or the current investor base has exhausted all efforts and it just doesn't make sense at that point. You're throwing good money after bad money, and then you have a debt cliff coming up. And so that's usually when the real serious conversations are starting to take place.
David, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a triggering event, and it's some sort of a capital need. And just depending on how tightly you're managing your business and your finances, or your creditors or your investors are, that could come with enough runway to be able to wind the company down. And it could come when it's too late, because I think what people forget is that it costs money even to go out of business. And so you can't be in a position where it's like, okay, we're not going to make payroll because it's too late. You know, your payroll, your employees come before everybody, and then you don't have enough money to even pay lawyers to wind you down, and it's messy. And so it's a catalyst, it's a need for capital. And the question is, how far in advance do you recognize that need for capital? And, you know, where's your threshold?
You know, that's what I wanted to kind of zero in on was, does it always have to be a catalyst, like a lender basically saying you're in default? Is it ever a case where a thoughtful board or management team says it's not going to work and start sort of on their own? Is that sort of the rare situation? Is that
We
the
found
outline?
a very rare situation. Management tends to be super optimistic about, and maybe in some way, shape, or form, unrealistic about their place in the market. Whether they have a moat around their business or not. So kind of a agreeable wind down typically does not happen. It typically comes in when a lot of the founders think that there's an unlimited amount of capital out there, particularly in 2001, early 2002. Everybody just thought the current investor base or the lender would save the day of the business, because nobody wants to liquidate a cannabis business because of the lack of bankruptcy protection. So I think during that time, people felt like there were other people that were going to come to the rescue. And when that capital was exhausted, and when the lender decided that there was no other alternative. So I think there's always typically a catalyst.
Sometimes there's not a lender though, especially in early stage companies, especially non-plant touching companies, and that becomes a little bit different. And I would agree with you in general, Tiffany, but I have seen in those situations where the management team just recognizes they can't get any more money. And, the people that are involved in the company have been working with them to recognize that you need a little bit of runway to shut down. And so a little bit more, but, not a lot.
So Jan, there's this concept of the zone of insolvency, right? And certainly boards and officers should be aware of that. Would you like to kind of give our audience a sense for what that means?
Sure. At the risk of sounding like I'm lecturing, I'm going to try to make this as quickly as quick
You
and
don't want to sound like a lawyer, do you?
and as quick as unlawyerly as I possibly can. So to get to the zone of insolvency, we have to first just make sure that everybody understands that the board has two duties: duty of care and duty of loyalty. Those are duties go to the company. They're owed to the company and by inference to the shareholders of the company. When the company is solvent, the duties of loyalty and care are owed to the shareholders, and therefore the creditors themselves, the trade creditors, the lenders, are all in the money and therefore are going to get paid. At that point, the creditors don't have standing to sue derivatively the board of directors or officers for breach of those duties. When the company is insolvent, then by definition, that means that the shareholders are out of the money. The shareholders were not going to get a distribution. And now the creditors do have standing to sue. There are some exceptions to these rules, of course, including there's some waivers that can be put into the documents of the organizational documents. But then, generally speaking, the creditors then do have the duty of care, the standing to sue on the duty of care or duty of loyalty. The zone of insolvency is that liminal space right above absolute insolvency. Is that space where the company doesn't absolutely know that it's insolvent, but it's vacillating back and forth. Something is happening that either the market is shifting constantly, or the liquidity is shifting constantly, or some other dynamic is happening, and the company is right before or right between solvency and insolvency. It's a very undefined space, and it by very definition is a broad path, a broad band, because of the vacillation, constant vacillation. It's hard to define. I mean, getting the accountants to define whether when you're insolvent, they can probably define it, although it's a little bit too late by that point. But defining zone of insolvency is not done by the accountants in any easy way. It's more like you're reaching it, and you should act like you're reaching it sooner rather than later.
So hard to define, but some things that boards and operators need to do if they've defined that they're there.
Well, so the general rule of thumb, at least from the legal standpoint, is to assume that unless you're definitively clear that you're solvent, fully solvent, and are getting some sort of assurances or comfort from the accounting group that you have solvency. But when you start suspecting that you're getting into the zone of insolvency, better to act as if you are in the zone of insolvency for the purpose of protecting the board of directors and officers. And we can talk about what the risks are in a moment, but because the band can be fairly wide, better to assume that you're in the zone of insolvency unless you're really feeling quite comfortable with where the business is going and with the including availability of cash and ability to pay bills and so on.
Got it.
Yeah, from an accounting standpoint, I'll say this, being an accountant, we look at it from a tangible net worth standpoint. And as soon as you turn negative in your tangible net worth, you're in the zone of insolvency, right? You can potentially catch up through cash flow. You can maybe keep yourself alive, but at a certain point, your cash flow, can't cover that. And you're in that zone and you need to be, really paying attention to what's going on.
Got it. Tip, or even David, so what does the decision tree look like for a company that's in the zone? Like, what's sort of the mental process they kind of go through?
I mean, I think from some of the ones that we've been involved in our current portfolio is, what type of product the company sells. Is the product still in demand? Are there still people wanting the product? Are there some assets that are not encumbered that can be, that the current cap table can come to the table with and lean up those assets? So there's some sort of protective layer there for them. Those are kind of the decisions kind of process that we go through at the end of the day well, there's no equity value clearly in an insolvency situation. There is some sort of value within the cannabis space sometimes for certain companies, certain products, certain assets. And so we kind of go through with the other players on the cap table of, can we put together some sort of rescue financing package? Can we put together some sort of pay to play package that incents people to put additional capital in, because it's a very lucrative structure if it works out, at the end of the day, knowing that we all believe there's some inherent value in the company left.
Yeah, that's the first part. Is it worth saving? What's the product? What's the environment for the product look like?
Well, I think that's the question is, are you liquidating and winding down, or are you restructuring and trying to survive? That's the first.
That's the first fork in the tree. Yeah, got it. All right. So anybody, so when you're in the zone, what's the responsibilities of officers and or the board?
Well, let me just maybe I could just tackle that as a starting point. The key element, because there's exposure now, there's added exposure. Now you have exposure from the creditors who could theoretically at least bring lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty. As a board, you're trying to make sure that you are that all decision making it can be made subject to high scrutiny at this point. So you want to make sure that you have full board minutes every time that there's a board meeting. That the board is now consulting with specialists who can advise the board about how to handle the situation from a legal standpoint and from a business standpoint. So you're operating on their heightened scrutiny level, which is I think what Tiffany was saying as well. The idea is everything that you're doing has to be super considered with again maximizing the value of the enterprise, but not being so much concerned about the business judgment aspect of it as the actual decision-making process itself. That's the key. You're still protected by the business judgment rule. You just have to be able to show that you as the board have considered all of the options and are looking to maximize value.
Got it. All right, let's shift gears slightly and just focus on the cannabis industry. Why is that harder and different for licensed plant touch businesses? And I am differentiating because our industry certainly has tech companies, ancillary companies that are not plant touching. So let's be sure we differentiate. But why is it hard for licensed businesses to kind of go down this path? David, maybe?
Yeah. So bankruptcy in particular is part of the federal court system. And since, cannabis is federally illegal, banks have thus far refused to entertain bankruptcy cases for companies that are plant touching almost unilaterally. I don't know if any have succeeded. And even the ancillary companies, quite frankly, have been challenged at being able to, get into a bankruptcy situation if they're, specifically if they're 100% serving cannabis, right? That's problematic, and so that eliminates that option right out of the gate, and you have to go to a more negotiated settlement, whether that is, with a hired, trustee, receiver, or just a consultant. I mean, there are now, rungs in the ladder, each getting progressively more expensive. And, then you got to figure out where you go from there.
If you've had a,
Also difficult in in the wind down of some of these cases, because the license don't move with the assets a lot of the time. So the asset isn't really the value. The license is in certain situations, and particularly in an Article 9, the license doesn't move with you. So in something like that, so it's very tricky. And like David said, it's we've seen non-plant touching companies who rely, obviously their income is from plant touching companies, and nobody will touch them, and they can't access any of the court's protections, and even in that scenario too. So it's very difficult if you're playing in any aspect of the cannabis space to be able to access a bankruptcy.
I'm actually surprised to learn that ancillary companies that serve the industry are potentially subject to the same restriction.
Because they're violating federal law by money laundering and aiding and
Taking their money,
It's
right?
the aiding and abetting part of it. It's the idea that, I think it's exactly as David said. It's the aiding and abetting part. The feds came down very hard on this. We were very surprised that policy was continued under this administration, but it was in fact, and it continues to be. I've even seen cases where the landlords renting space to these, or even just a portion of their space, those landlords can't avail themselves of the bankruptcy process.
All right, so not an easy Rubik cube to straighten out. Jan, so if the decision is to cease operations, what are the typical options for a company? I know we can rule bankruptcy off the top, because right now that's not available to cannabis related and plant touching businesses. But what are the other kinds of options for companies?
Well, so there's the first option, which is the more formal of the option. Well, the more process oriented option is something called an assignment for the benefit of creditors. It's really a bankruptcy under state law, but there's some benefits to it, and there's some downsides to it. An ABC basically entails the company assigning its assets to an assignee who acts effectively as a trustee. The purpose of the assignee is to liquidate, sell, and distribute the proceeds to the creditors. The upside is that because and in some states, by the way, you don't even have to register in a court. Like in California, for example, it doesn't even have to be, at least initially, registered in the court. The upside for an ABC is that you have a fiduciary who's accounting for everything to the creditors. In some respects, a sale is faster than in an ABC than it would be in a bankruptcy context. So that's a big advantage as opposed to a disadvantage. But you can't, for example, transfer certain assets that might be key to the business. Like you cannot transfer leases. This is something that you can do in bankruptcy. You cannot do in an ABC. There's also no cap on landlord claims in an ABC. So it has some advantages. It's a process that can be costly. The disadvantage is that it's because there's no automatic stay. Again, something that stops creditors from pursuing their claim in bankruptcy. Because there's no automatic stay, the creditors can pursue the assets during the bankruptcy, and so there's some lawsuits that during the ABC. Sorry, there are some lawsuits that can continue. So that option has its own little value and its own sort of set of considerations. The ABC. A negotiated settlement is another option. That's just one where you might, for example, consider giving the assets under Article 9 to the secured creditor and let them foreclose and see what's left of it. There are some other circumstances that can be explored under those circumstances. Again, all outside of bankruptcy, all outside of court altogether at this point. And then the third and last option well, I suppose one option is just walk away, but that's not an option that is recommended for any circumstance, under any circumstances, because it takes all the value and all the credibility of management away when you just walk away from a business like this. Even if there's nothing there, some accountability is necessary. So there is this third non-court proceeding option, which is this dissolution, this option of just dissolving the business. That's done under state law. And you can formalize that process to a certain extent. The concept there being more about focusing on accountability and focusing on transparency. Those are the key. The creditors, the body of people who are owed money want transparency and they want accountability.
Got it. So let's talk about the use of a liquidation advisor to help companies that don't want to go through the court system necessarily, that want to be responsible, don't want to disappear, but to take the burden away. You know, somebody that understands the process of what has to happen. Can you sort of speak to that?
I can start. I'm sure David can was that to David? Because I think David has a tremendous amount of experience in this area as well.
Well, let's start with you, and then let's hear David's views as well.
Well, so what we've done is we help sort of make the dissolution into a process that achieves several things. First, it sort of just regiments the process, and so creates a set of steps that will be followed by the company and the board and the remaining officer or two that will ensure that the process is smooth, is complete, and is following state law. The other aspect of it is that by following this sort of regimented process, we're also helping guide the board. And in guiding the board, we're giving this extra layer of protection to the board in the event that a creditor starts agitating on the notion of breach of fiduciary duty. So so we then set up a process. We establish the necessary resolutions that for the board to adopt. We help provide advice on the specific assets and how to liquidate what's left. Again, if there's significant going concern, that's a different option. That's really more for the ABC, but we're talking about there is no going concern. There is no further liquidity. We just need to really just shutting it down. There are some miscellaneous assets that might be able to be liquidated. So we help maximize the value. We provide a centralized place for all the creditors to communicate. So rather than calling the various officers or whoever's left at the business, we provide that point of contact. We send a communication to all the creditors, setting a deadline by which claims can be filed. We then review the claims with management. We coordinate the distribution to creditors, if any. It's unusual for there to be a significant distribution. Once in a while, there's a distribution that has to be made to creditors, and we both coordinate it and account for it. We also coordinate throughout this process with the accountants, because final tax returns need to be filed and dissolution paperwork needs to be filed. And then we work with local, depending on the state of incorporation or the state of formation. We'll work with local counsel to confirm that the dissolution is done in the legal process that's necessary, for example, in Delaware or in California, Arizona, wherever these companies might exist. That's just the process. We're just helping establish a process and providing accountability throughout the process. Throughout all of this, an officer is remaining at the company to execute what's necessary. For example, sign the final returns, sign the checks as necessary, and sign the final documentation.
But not really in a full-time capacity, really in an oversight of the process.
Right, and accountable to. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I would imagine that the board also, many of the board members might step down at that point, or do they typically all stay on?
They mostly step down, and we really try to encourage there to be a core 3 or 5 members, if at all possible, to make some final decisions. They're not critical once they adopt the dissolution plan. They're not critical for further decisions, but we try to encourage them to stay. They are not required. One officer is required, and so one thing that we try to implement is some process by which that officer will be compensated, and the risk will be protected. They'll be protected from extra risk for what they're doing. And most of the time we've had no problem finding somebody, but there are times when somebody of greater expertise is necessary. Somebody like David, for example, is critical because they understand the whole structure holistically. And that's more than just simply doing it on a transaction by transaction basis, but really knowing how to negotiate globally with the various entities.
David, anything to add to that?
I mean, I think it was pretty comprehensive. I think, again, it's an evaluation process, and it's an easing in process. I tend to recommend to people that they start by trying to resolve it internally with an advisor like myself, who's going to be a lot less expensive, but also, the liability is not going to shift as much as it would to somebody like Jan. They're still going to have to do all the work. I'm just going to advise them on what they need to do. I will be that secondary person that can validate that they're asking the right questions. And if you have cooperation, it's important to remember that anything can be negotiated, and anybody can sign a piece of paper that settles everything. And that's the cheapest and easiest way to go. The minute it starts to get contentious, starts to escalate, that's when you need to move to people that are going to take a fiduciary role and be a trustee or a receiver. I would also say that a lot of what's being discussed right now, we haven't said anything about D&O insurance. And one of the things that's super, super, super important is to make sure that if you have D&O insurance, that you're working with your carrier properly and that you're protected and in compliance and stuff like that. If you don't have D&O insurance, you need to be very, very careful, even more so, because there's nothing to backstop you. And the last thing too is that we haven't mentioned is, are there personal guarantees? Because those present a real problem in that you can't give yourself preference in a liquidation. So you have to negotiate carefully to come out of it whole. Otherwise, you're going to end up being on the hook for like a lease or something like that, where you're personally guaranteed. You can't go to the landlord and try to negotiate out, pay him and not pay your other creditors, or you're going to be in worse trouble than if you left it. So there's just a lot of details that you have to evaluate up front in order to get to these different scenarios and in the right order, so that you maximize your minimize your expenses and maximize your knowledge.
Yeah, years ago, I did a little of this kind of consulting work actually with Jan. One of the things that we did is we had them out of available proceeds extend the D&O as almost the first order of business, to give them time, to kind of get through this process and make sure there was a sufficient tail.
Yeah.
Also, when I graduated college and I was 22 years old, I started a business. I ran it 7 years, and sadly, at the time in Boston, the Bank of New England got taken over by Resolution Trust, the liquidating government entity. All their real estate portfolio, we weren't in real estate, I was in tech, but they called my loan. And when you talk about a catalyst, that was the catalyst for me having to wind down my business. It was 7 years later, so I was 31. I didn't know any of this. So what did I do? I did it by myself. I looked at who I owed. I looked at, what receivables I could probably collect. I tried to figure out how I could get rid of my inventory to turn it into cash to pay things down. And I paid down 50, 60 cents on the dollar, all the way from the secureds to the unsecureds. But here's the question. I did it myself without expertise. The truth is, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was going by sort of intuition. So Jan, what kind of cover does hiring a liquidation advisor, somebody that's got expertise, give to the company officers and the board?
Well, the credibility of the person. I mean, it's, David comes forward with his credibility and his background. I come forward with mine. You come forward with yours. When the creditors who are obviously understandably frustrated. They haven't been paid. They've been strung along. Probably by the time we get into the picture, they've been strung along for quite some time. They have been told one story and another about the company being turned around and or new investors coming in or new money coming in. So the credibility of management is suffering. That doesn't mean that it's gone, but it's suffering. When we come into the picture and we give them a fair assessment of what we think, and we generally are very careful about what we say because our reputation, precedes us, and it's very important that we keep that reputation. When we say, you will receive a small but something distribution, or for that matter, when we say you will not receive a distribution, in any of those instances, it is more comforting, I think, and the message is taken better by the creditor body than if management is trying to sort this out. It's not to say it's impossible. It's just to say that we add a little bit of credibility and definitely some accountability to the process. And I found this over and over again, where, in fact, in some of the cases that we work together, Jeff, that where the creditors were absolutely irate by the time we got into the picture. I mean, screaming and yelling and starting lawsuits. But we were able to, by just simply calming them down and saying to them, look, in those cases, we did have Chapter 7 as an option. But even if we had to just go into an ABC as a threat, the fact of the matter is we can tell them what the end result is going to be from the very beginning. We can tell them if you really do sue, you're not going to get paid anything. Or if you and you're going to be spending good money after bad. So let us do the process. Call us every week if you wish. And that's what we did. You and I did that. We had some creditors. We put them on a weekly call, and they felt comforted by that. So that's one thing that we bring. I don't know, David, has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, yes, definitely. And I think it's also formalizing the process. The first thing I do as a consultant is I determine who's at the top of the creditor stack. And then we form a creditors committee. And then we communicate to all the creditors, letting them know where they're at in the stack and what's going on. And then we focus on the senior secured creditors because they're the ones that are going to drive the conversations. And we try to maintain communication because, again, there's credibility out of the gate, but there's also credibility in continuing to communicate. The answer to getting cover, I mean, you can get cover by having someone like me or someone like Jan at varying degrees, in that you can, I'm not going to take away your liability, but you can point to me and say, hey, well, this guy was our consultant and he told me that it was okay to pay this vendor because I vetted the fact that the vendor is critical to the ongoing survival of the asset, right? And I can say that in a certain manner. You start to get up to, situations where you have a trustee or an attorney, they will give you more cover because they're actually taking on that liability, right? So, I tend to do a lot of what I do as a principal, but that's because I have a lot of knowledge and experience in the industry. And so for my portfolio companies, I can do what you did, Jeff, but from a very, very, educated perspective. That's very difficult to do, if you've never done it before. And it's a bit of a roll of the dice. You may get lucky. You don't want to get lucky when you're dealing with something like this.
You don't want to rely on getting lucky.
Yeah.
Solely.
And guarantees, I mean, as David said, guarantees are very tricky. They on the one hand, some creditors want to sue on the guarantees right away. They don't want to wait. They just want to be right there and use the guarantees as a pressure point. On the other hand, if they know that you're going through a process, even if they sue on the guarantee, if you're going through an organized process where there's at least a possibility of some return to creditors, the very process itself might delay the lawsuit on the guarantee, because the person who's being sued on the guarantee is going to say, wait, judge, just on that lawsuit, wait, let's just see what happens on the liquidation, and then we'll come back to me at the end of the process. So even that alone can delay this, all the activity of the creditors and channel it a little bit so that the principal is not spending money protecting themselves on the guarantee while also spending all their energies trying to figure out how to wind down the business.
Yeah, I'll tell you something that I learned is on the way into a deal, we all say time kills all deals. On the way out of a deal, time heals all deals. The more you can get people to slow down, understand, and be communicative, the better off you're going to be. The more you try to rush through things, the more you're going to antagonize people, scare people, piss people off, and create
Sure.
more.
Must be my experience as well. Always been that if you just, give them the answer, not just pat answers, but give them the details, give them the accounts, give them what's going on, so that they see what's going on. They know that although there isn't a fiduciary, there is a quasi fiduciary like David or like Jan or whoever out there who's accountable and who's not going to be running away with the money. Over time, emotions just ebb and everything just relaxes a little bit. And we've seen a lot of instances where there was a threat of lawsuit from the very beginning. A massive lawsuit is coming. The lawsuit never comes because they get they get the full accounting and they know that there's nothing left there to squeeze out of the lemon.
And I think I remember in the creditor base on the 3 that we worked on, it was always a small, fairly insignificant creditor that made the most noise. And the more mature ones, whether it was a company that had a CFO, they kind of know the game. If they get the confidence that it's being handled correctly and that there's a third party introduced, they let the process run itself out. They know pretty much that they're going to end up with more rather than less. So I'm sure, David, you've experienced the same thing. It's, the squeaky wheel who's usually the smallest guy.
Yeah, it's true, and I agree. I think what you need to keep in mind, and this again comes with the expertise, is that those people usually get hurt a lot more by much smaller dollars. So what you're dealing with in that instance is emotion. And there are justifications in certain situations to get rid of some of those really squeaky wheels that are, small dollar amounts, but, have a tendency to suffer disproportionately. But again, it's recognizing who you're talking to and what you're doing. And the other thing that hasn't been thrown out there in terms of creditors and stuff like that I really want to put in front is that if you're at a point where you can't make payroll, you're way too late. It's important for everybody on here to know that payroll pierces the corporate veil. So the directors and the officers of the company are going to be responsible for not only the wages that go unpaid, but all the penalties and all the interest that are going to accrue while these EEOC claims and labor claims are worked through the 2-3 year process. Those can be really, really, really painful. You don't want to be in a position where you don't have money to make payroll.
Payroll then taxes, right?
Well,
Payroll.
taxes not only payroll taxes.
Right.
Other
Payroll
taxes,
and payroll related taxes and sales taxes.
Payroll,
To the extent
taxes.
Sales tax.
Sales tax, right. We've got 10 minutes left, so I just want to remind the audience that we can field questions. We usually reserve 10 minutes. I don't see any in the chat. Carolyn, if you see anyone's in the chat, interrupt this, but I've got 1 or 2 more questions that will continue on unless some questions come up. So Jan, going through the courts with a receiver or a trustee versus not going through the courts, can you just give us a sense for the pros and cons of that? Is it a control, like what's more expedient? What's easier? Give us a sense for how one might think of that.
Are you, Jeff, are you referring to ABCs in the courts versus not court? Yeah. Okay. So ABCs
or any vehicle where there's a trustee engaged by the court.
Yeah. So
ABC.
We're skipping through the possibility of a Chapter 7 because that's just not available in this industry. So we're really talking about ABCs. ABCs are the cost of an ABC. I saw written somewhere between 5%, 5 and 15, or 5 and 20% of the value, the remaining enterprise value. So that can be relatively expensive. You do, on the one hand, get to choose who your assignee is. So, and the assignee can be a lawyer. It does not have to be, or an accountant, or even just somebody who specializes. There are lots of companies in California, elsewhere, where the market is very sophisticated and very developed on assignments and for the benefit of creditors. And there are companies which serve over and over again as the assignee. And they know how to liquidate and how to get the process done. The advantage in an ABC is that you can usually identify a purchaser and you present the purchaser to the assignee, and the assignee can close sometimes theoretically within a matter of days, because it's none of it, if it's an estate that doesn't require court approval, none of it requires court approval. Some states like California, as I said, don't require court approval. I believe in Delaware, there may be some court approval requirements. In New Jersey, I believe, it's a state by state issue. And if you do require court approval, that gets more complicated. It gets more lengthy. And at that point, it starts resembling very much like a Chapter 7 case. in either event, whether it's with or without court approval, you are ultimately putting the fiduciary duty in the hands of a fiduciary, of somebody outside. You're taking it outside of management's control. You may be identifying the purchaser and you may be identifying the assignee, but they have to feel comfortable with each other. The assignee has to feel, because they're going to have to justify their actions, they're going to have to feel comfortable about the due diligence and the notice, and that all the requirements of the sale have been met, and the closing and everything else. Bearing in mind, of course, that some things can't be sold. You cannot sell a lease. So all of that sort of gets factored into whether an ABC is worthwhile. The biggest issue that I find in an ABC, leaving aside the costs, is also the loss of control. The thing about this whole process of winding down and doing it with David at the helm, or a consulting firm like ours at the helm, one thing or another, the management stays in control. And that allows for a lot of fine-tuned decisions, including, as David said, for example, deciding that a vendor is critical. You can just decide that vendor is critical, and you can justify it under the business judgment rule. And if David or I say that this support the decision that the vendor has to be paid, management has protection from an outside consultant who's being paid to do this when under the auspices of the business judgment rule. So I think that would be sort of a beginning of it. What do you think, David? I mean, when you're looking at these things, how do you consider it?
Yeah, I look, court protection is, to the extent that it's not required, is a bit of a formality if you do things right. Anybody can negotiate their way through a settlement. If you do an Article 9 foreclosure, you auction off the assets, you should be able to present clean title to a purchaser if you have a credible auctioneer and you have a credible consultant, because at the end of the day, that purchaser has to walk away knowing that the assets that they purchased are not going to be challenged, and the liabilities will follow the asset, right? And so if you need court protection because there's questionability around the liabilities following the asset, then that's really kind of where I draw the line, right? If you have an Article 9 foreclosure and you have an auction house that conducts the auction, you have somebody that comes and pays something for the asset, and that company doing the auction has run the auction properly, has given proper public notice, has sent out notices to all the creditors, invited them to the auction, you're reasonably sure that you're, as a purchaser, going to get a clean asset, but you're never guaranteed. And so the only thing that the courts end up doing, in my opinion, is provide that next level of guarantee. Even a court can be challenged, but now you're talking about an infinitesimal level of risk. So to me, that's where it comes down, and that's also dictated by how difficult your people are. I mean, there's a certain point where it's just not worth the headache. Like, fine, just walk away.
Right, and it should be noted, I think, when you're saying Article 9, I think we're talking about, we are working with our secured creditors under those circumstances. It is a
you have to represent
process.
the secured
It's an
creditor.
aligned process with the secured creditor.
Yeah, the secured creditor, unless you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they have to initiate the foreclosure, and then the secured creditor is the one who actually hires the auctioneer and the consultant, and then the question is, where does the money come from, right? So that secured creditor has to be either willing to pay those fees, or the company has to be in a position to be able to pay those fees and willing to pay those fees. It gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah, it's always the question that I get, and I'm sure, Jeff, you get this all the time, as well as David. I mean, this question of how does it get paid? Who pays for the process? And I think, back to you, David, on the back to what you were saying on payroll. You got to get the payroll done. You got to get the taxes resolved as best as you can, bearing in mind that we're talking about sales and fiduciary taxes. We're not talking necessarily about income taxes for the company, but at the end of the day, you got to keep some budget, which goes right back to the very beginning of the comment from Jeff. We need, the sooner you identify the problems, the more money you can marshal for this process. But you always have to leave some money for the process. Pay the employees, pay the professionals. You protect yourself, you protect everybody else by doing it that way.
I would say a good rule of thumb, once you've made your last payroll, because that's just not an option, right? You're going to need anywhere between $50,000 and $150,000 to wind down a company, unless you're me and you can do it all yourself, right? That's just not realistic. but you're going to need somewhere in that neighborhood. And even I have to hire a lawyer to do, the paperwork and stuff like that. That's a minimum of 25 grand once we negotiated the paper.
Great stuff, guys. Really appreciate it. Let me just, we're really towards the end. We got 5 minutes. Let me just ask each of you to maybe make one final comment about this. Certainly, you could just off the cuff come up with one. If you don't have one, maybe sort of think about maybe one thing, a primary thing, an officer or board member can do to make sure they stay out of trouble in this situation. But just one kind of parting comment for our audience would be very useful here.
David.
Yeah, I mean, tangible net worth. Look at when your, short-term assets and your short-term liabilities go into the wrong direction. And when you start getting close there, you got to really be seeking advice on a regular basis from somebody to help guide you through where the point of no return is. So if your receivables and your accounts aren't more than your liabilities in your next payroll, it's time to raise the white flag.
Yeah, and I echo exactly the same sentiment. I've always said this to my clients, my consultancies. The sooner you identify the problem, the better, the more options you will have. The later you identify the problems, the less options you have. You run out of options very quickly.
So the guidance is act fast and be in action.
Early advice is cheap.
Yeah.
Later advice gets more and more expensive.
Got it. Well, look, guys, thank you so much. This is great. Really appreciate it. So let me just sort of say again, as panelists, Tiff has left early, but thank you for your time and your knowledge. These are the kinds of things our audience needs to learn about. Our VC peers need to learn about. Some have lots of experience, some don't have a lot of experience. And we want to be able to give them the information, educate them, and if necessary, engage with them to help them. So thank you, guys. I also want to thank our audience, those of you who are viewing directly and those of you who are streaming on Facebook and LinkedIn. I know we get a lot of you, we just don't know who you are. This is not an easy subject, as I said at the beginning, and as I think you heard through the program, but a necessary one. Now, we're going to be posting this to our website in our replay section if you want to listen again and share. And please reach out to me if you'd like a free consultation to help think through some of these issues. We're happy to do that. And be on the lookout for information about our upcoming program. I think our next one is in May 11th, titled Analytics in Cannabis. We do have one more poll up, if you would be so kind as to fill that out. I think we're going to keep that up for a minute or two. But for now, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I usually like to stop these things exactly on the hour. I'm 2 minutes early, but that's all I got. So enjoy yourselves. And again, David, Jan, and Tip, wherever you are, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Not to hear from you.
Bye.